Hello and welcome to the Joe Ligato Show. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Ligato, and today we're going to be continuing on talking about this article from Signification on why Chinese democracy is better than Western democracy. And so we've talked about how the West, their form of democracy, is all about voting, and it's kind of a just entertainment where the politicians lie to you and you vote for people who have the best persona, but you don't really expect them to actually get anything done. We talked about how studies do show that the Western style democracy is owned by the 1% most richest people in the West. We talked about various things related to form, substance, function, and appearance of a given thing, which is something that the Chinese and ancient Greek philosophers have in common in terms of breaking something down into those three things. We talked about how Western democracy compares to China in terms of what are they actually accomplishing? Are people happy with it? Do they have a lot of optimism about the future? We talked about a lot of these things. And so we talked about who does democracy belong to, and we talked about how various things like high-speed rails showed that the Western democracy just doesn't function in terms of meeting the needs of people. And we talked about how China has orders of magnitude more high-speed rails than the Western countries. So it's hundreds of, kilometers, miles of high-speed rails versus 42,000 kilometers of high-speed rails in China. And so now we're getting into, across essentially every quantitative measure, China is doing better than the United States. They're just, people are just more satisfied with them. They're not dying by the hundreds of thousands of drug overdoses per year. They're not wasting away by overeating in order to distract themselves from the decline of America. They're not doing all these different things that show the ailment of the West. So how does China do it? How do they choose competent leaders so that all these things can be done in China? And now we're going to get into that. So, third question is whether democracy chooses talent who are good at governing or talents who are good at putting on a show. Well, I guess we could see Western-style democracy, in which the leader of a country is elected primarily through competitive elections, poses the problem that certain businessmen, actors, and other political amateurs with no experience or qualifications can become president. Okay, so they're talking about Donald Trump there. This is inconsistent with the basic logic of modern-day professional development. And that's completely true. Something that I don't know if they're even going to get into this in this article, but think about how different Western democracy is from any other type of organization, even in the West. Things like term limits don't actually make sense. Don't get me wrong. When I was younger, I'm like, oh, all these politicians need term limits. We need to get them out of office after a while. Here's the thing, though. If you're looking at a CEO, what you want is you want to be able to remove a bad CEO quickly if they're doing a poor job. You don't want to have to wait until the end of their term limits because, they don't usually have term limits for CEOs. But if they're doing a good job, you want to keep that CEO in the position for as long as possible because they're doing a good job. Sure, you have succession planning because you don't want the company to just die out whenever the current leader either leaves or passes away. But if they're doing a good job, you don't actually get rid of them ever. You don't have term limits on a CEO. For some reason, in Western democracy, we keep bad politicians in office for the entirety of their term limit, or for the entirety of their term, unless they've committed a crime, like an actual crime that would have them removed from office. And so it's really, really weird that we keep bad people in office. We don't have quicker ways of removing them if they're incompetent. And when we have a good politician in office, we actually remove them through the term limit. And so it just doesn't make sense. I don't know how people wrap their heads around this, if they thought about this, like really been intentional about it. But how do you grapple with the fact that in Western democracies, our politicians, if they're good, are forced out of office after a certain amount of time. And if they're bad, they're forced in office, forced to stay in office for the entirety of their term limits unless they've done something illegal. That's not how things work in any other form of organization. So please, if you're a Western democracy lover, please explain that to me in the comment section, because I'd love to hear it, because it doesn't make one iota of sense. And we know that it doesn't make one iota of sense, because if it did, it'd be implemented in other types of organizations across the West. Okay, so this form of democracy, based off of just like putting on a show, is inconsistent with the basic logic of modern day professional development. All right, we see here, almost all modern professions require a step-by-step process of advancement based on qualifications, competence, and performance. And yet Western-style democracy assumes that a job of the utmost importance, like the presidency, can be achieved in one single step without climbing up the career ladder. That's really true. Unless you have some sort of qualification, I don't understand why you would be able to be voted into office, like the highest office. Like, there's no promotion system, there's no development to get there. When you're thinking about CEOs, you have to have some type of comparable experience in order to become a CEO. In fact, it'd be illegal, really, to, if you just said, oh, this person has a degree from Harvard, we're going to put them into the CEO position because they have a degree from Harvard. Or we're going to put them into CEO position because they're really handsome or they're really good with their words. I mean, if they don't have some sort of qualifications that would make them qualifications to make them qualify for the job, it's illegal to hire them. I mean, you're not allowed to hire people for things that are unrelated to predictions of future job performance. So why, as a president, can we do these things? Can we install people as the president of the nation, the highest position, or supposedly the highest position in the nation, if they don't have any indicators of future job performance? If it's just based off of people's votes, and they're not voting based off of actual competence, then that's a scary system. That's a system that we don't implement in any other form, as far as I can tell, aside from things that are supposed to be like clones of our presidential election. So whenever you're doing things like a high school or college presidential election, things like that, that are replications of our national presidential election, you do the same thing, but it doesn't make sense. It really should be based off of the actual qualifications of the person. So as a industrial and organizational psychologist, I would say that when you're doing personnel selection, you have to make sure that your various measures of your various ways, your various hiring practices align with future job performance. And so all these different metrics, all these different tools that you're using have to be indicators. You have to be able to tie it in to future job performance. And right now, our election system is completely decoupled from any form of indicators of future job performance. And so if you're a personnel selection specialist with my type of degree, IO psychology degree, you would look at Western democracies and say, wait a minute, this system makes no sense. It doesn't actually align with indicators of future job performance. You can't do this. This is illegal. It's going to lead to some type of discrimination. It's not going to lead to the best candidate getting the job. And so just from an IO psychology perspective, it's clear to see that the Chinese system more aligns with what we understand from our various fields of research, such as personnel selection, about how to get the best person in the job without having some form of unfair discrimination occurring. So another hypothesis, of course, is that the best people can be selected through the election process. However, the problem remains that those who are good at running for office may not be good at governing the country. We actually have found this in IO psychology literature as well. So it's really cool. Like, IO psychology isn't really developed in China, and I'd really love to help them develop IO psychology in China. So if you know someone, please get them in contact with me. But what they're saying here is entirely true about what we know about leaders of companies. So the people who might found a company, the entrepreneurs that put a company together, aren't necessarily the leaders you want in place after the company is already established, because the type of leaders who are good at creating companies are not necessarily the type of leaders who are good at running established companies. And so you have to come up with that decoupling. There are different types of leadership that don't necessarily overlap with each other. And just something else is that the people who are most qualified, we know from research, for leadership positions aren't necessarily the people who are the most likely to emerge as leaders in any given scenario. You have to be very intentional about these things. You have to make sure that you have the right leaders at the right times in the right positions. Okay, so yeah. There's a saying in the United States that politicians campaign in poetry, but they govern in prose. However, these two skills are not compatible. Yeah, so it seems like the Chinese view is very aligned with IO psychology, and so I love that they know this. I don't know if this is just like hard-won knowledge through millennia of having a Chinese civilization state, or if they've actually read the IO psychology literature that's developed within the past. I mean, it's probably been like 100 years. The field as it's known as IO psychology is only a few decades old, but the field as a whole is, I mean, it depends on how far you go back, but there's various like time and motion studies, and then you have like the beginning of psychology with people like Wilhelm Wundt. But really, IO psychology at most, I would say, is probably like 100 years old. And so I'd be curious to see if Chinese leadership has actually read the research literature in IO psychology, because what they're talking about here is definitely IO psychology related research. It's something that we can back them up on what they're saying here. In these times where attention is king, one of the manifestations of democracy's deterioration is that lectures have become like a talent show. Okay, so really interesting comment here. I'm going to highlight that specific section. Okay, so we do say that we're in the attention economy, and I want people to think about this for a second. If you're watching, we are in the attention economy because the oil of our time is behavioral data. We want to be able to understand people and persuade people, and in cases of artificial intelligence, replicate people's behavior. And so the reason we are in the attention economy is because we want people's attention so we could get their behavioral data. So really at the core of it is people data, behavioral data is the oil of our time. Remember that. Okay? And so China clearly understands that, given what they just said here. And we can clearly see that the West is not doing a good job in terms of maintaining people's attention, because people are spending more time focusing on politics, but they're spending less time actually voting and engaging with the political system. And so that tells you a lot. That tells you that people are concerned that the system isn't functioning, so they're spending a lot of time on it, but they don't see that voting is an actual way to solve the problem. And so just concerning all around there. And China understands this. Okay, so electoral competence has become the ability to perform in such a show. So they're entertainers. That's why people like Donald Trump. I don't have anything necessarily against Donald Trump, but his ability to be elected shows that it is an entertainment. It's a show. It's not actually based off of a person's competence. And you can say the same for Joe Biden, really, because you have someone like Donald Trump coming out of nowhere with not really any transferable skills to be a successful president of the United States, becoming president. And so that's obviously bad. That's not how personnel selection should happen. But then you have someone like Joe Biden, who's an elected official for decades, and he did a terrible job for those decades. And so you should be like, well, wait a minute, just seniority shouldn't mean that you get the office. It should be based off of actual competence. And we see that that is not the case. It's a show. And even when a person is a bad performer, if the people running the show, the big business within America, want a certain performer to go out on stage, they do it. So Joe Biden, he's senile, he's extremely old, but they push him out on stage because they need someone to be a figurehead, and he's their best shot at being a figurehead right now. So we see that electoral competence in the cases of people like Joe Biden, like Donald Trump, really has nothing to do with whether they were elected or not. Being good at raising money, setting issues, putting on a show, stirring up emotions, and attracting attention is not the same as being good at governing a country. So we can statistically measure this too. We have to figure out ways of quantifying raising money. That's obviously easy. You just figure out how much money is raised. It's a quantitative number. Setting issues, that might be a little bit more difficult to quantify. Putting on a show, I mean, you could just ask people their satisfaction with the person as a whole versus maybe their satisfaction with the politician's issues, things like that. Maybe, I don't know, stirring up emotion. So you could, that's a pre-post test. You just ask them before the presidential candidate gets on stage what they're feeling, and then you ask again afterwards. And if they're able to stir up emotions, then you could say that that politician is good at stirring up emotions and attracting attention. So you just see how long people attend to a speech by a certain presidential candidate. And so these are quantitative things. In governing a country, that there's a ton of quantitative metrics you can use there. Obviously, this article, as we've seen in prior videos and as I've kind of harped on and ranted about a lot, is things like building high-speed rails. That's something that a good governance system would be able to do, and a bad one would not be able to do, because there's not immediate financial profit from the creation of a train system. And so this is all quantitative, and we can measure these and see if these other things are related to governance of a country. And I would imagine, based off of my understanding of the research literature, they're not necessarily related to governing a country. You do see a little bit, like, I know things like college presidents, a lot of their job is raising money. And so you can say that some of this is at least somewhat related to governing a country or governing an organization, et cetera, et cetera. But things like putting on a show, stirring emotions, not necessarily related to a country, although it could be related to certain aspects of a country. But I don't want to get into the minutiae. What I'm saying is that these aren't completely overlapping. You have to think of it as these are being used as predictors of presidential job performance, and this is our measure of presidential job performance here. And how much do they overlap? And I would say not overly much, probably not overly much. Another indicator of democracy's deterioration is the continued prevalence of party spoils and rewards in politics. Okay, let's see what they have to say about this. In the past, the U.S.'s competitive electoral system had a party spoil system. I don't know much about this, so I'm going to be interested in this. Although this problem was subsequently addressed through various reforms of its civil service, in reality, a successful election today still creates such spoils that the winner then has the right to distribute. Oh, okay. So they're talking about being able to so you have a person who's elected, and then underneath that person who's elected, you have a ton of people who aren't elected. They're just appointed by someone like the president. And that's really concerning, because you can't, if you appoint people who don't have experience in the position, then you lose a lot of the organizational knowledge. So between presidents, you actually have to keep a lot of people who were previously appointed by the prior presidents. And guess what? This is how a deep state is created. You have people who are unelected officials. You can't remove them from their position because there's no one else who knows how these things are done. They have all the institutional knowledge. And so here we see, let's keep reading. The U.S. president has the authority to appoint around 7,000 government officials, of which only around 500 require the Senate's approval. Okay, so the vast majority, over an order of magnitude, do not require Senate's approval. So there's no approval process. It's just this one person who got elected president, who didn't even necessarily have to have any qualifications for president. They just had to be very persuasive during the election. They don't need any approval for the appointment of all these extremely influential positions. And what ends up happening is these people end up staying between administrations, and they create the deep state. So overall, the appointment process is quite arbitrary. One can reward one's friends, relatives, or those who helped out during the election process. Trump frequently alerted officials on Twitter that they were fired, but in fact, other presidents have also done the same thing. It is just that Trump brought this practice into the open. That's something that I say a lot, is that the deep state does not hate Trump because of his policies. They hate Trump because he's so overt about exposing his corruption and other people's corruption within our American governmental structure. So he will come out and say, and this was one that I really loved. I'm a big supporter of Syria, and former President Trump just came out and said, while in office, that yeah, we're in Syria to steal their oil. And it's something that every American president would do, because you don't get elected to that office unless you're corrupt. But he's the one that will outright say it. And he's not supposed to say it. You're not supposed to be able to peek behind the curtain about how things work in America. So him saying that is concerning to the deep state. And you see, because he says that type of thing and the deep state just like riots over it. But then they're not rioting because they don't like the policy, because current President Biden is in office and he's maintaining the same policies on Syria. So it's not the policy that upsets them about former President Trump. It was the fact that he exposed what they were doing. He exposed the corruption that he was doing. He was just, the funny thing is, people just like, Donald Trump is an extremely honest man. If he's going to be screwing you over, he'll tell you to your face. He will expose when the United States is just going to your country to steal oil. And that's something that they just couldn't accept. They couldn't tolerate. So this is an interesting paragraph here, talking about how the deep state was able to arise within the United States. So let's continue reading. The prime minister must be a provincial official, and renowned general must rise up the ranks. Okay. So what they're saying here is that in order to be a general, you have to start off at a lower tier. In order to be a prime minister, you have to start off as like a regional minister type of person. We see here, quote has been used on a number of occasions by Xi Jinping. Okay, so Xi Jinping understands that he rose up, blanking on which specific region it was. Might have been, I think he started off somewhere else, but then moved to Beijing as a high official in Beijing, and then he became the leader of China. Officials in China's whole process, people's democracy, are mainly chosen through competitive selection. In our country, many of our provinces have populations in tens of millions or hundreds of millions, equivalent size to the population of the world's biggest countries. Ruling a province is thus equivalent to ruling a country. Before being able to join the Politburo Standing Committee, one has to familiarize oneself with local conditions first, followed by national conditions. So something to remember here is, because Donald Trump had no real administrative experience, no experience running anything such as a country, he had to rely on deep state actors. Like, that was the reason that people like Pompeo and what's the big warmonger guy? I know I can visualize his mustache, but I cannot remember his name right now. But he had to have people like that in office, like Pompeo, because he needed parts of the deep state within his administration in order to get it functioning whatsoever, because these people are the only ones with the institutional knowledge. And so if you don't have some type of governmental experience, you're going to need to rely on deep state actors. And so China has something of a system in order to make sure that at least the people who get into office have some type of governmental knowledge, so they don't have to rely as heavily on something like a deep state. President Xi Jinping governed a village for 6 years, a county for 3 years, 3 cities for 11 years, and 3 provinces for another 11 years. He was also trained in the party system, the administrative system, National People's Congress system, and the military system, then moved on to the central government, where he gained an extra 5 years of experience before finally becoming the country's top leader. Okay, so again, experience does not necessarily mean you're competent or qualified for a job, but it does certainly help. It's hard to be qualified for a job without any sort of experience whatsoever. But at the same time, you have to be aware that having experience does not necessarily mean you're doing a good job at the thing. And we could see that with current President Biden, who a ton of experience, decades of experience in American government, and did a terrible job. So he just would not be qualified for president in a Chinese system. China's competitive selection system ensures that government officials have a wealth of practical experience. More importantly, they are tested through practice, not through votes. They must go through multiple layers of practice, testing, and selection before they can become leaders of our country. China's competitive selection system is a way of picking a team of capable and professional national administrators. And I say this all the time, but China has millennia of creating an efficient bureaucratic system. They're the best in the world, I would say. And they take a lot of pride in that. They have various testing requirements, and everyone has to go through those testing requirements. And so they are able to filter out people who are a lot of tell and not a lot of show. They're not able to actually do anything, but they're able to just kind of brag about it. So those people like Donald Trump just would not get selected as a president in the Chinese system. And then people who actually have a lot of experience, but they're not good at it, they're not doing a good job, such as current president Joe Biden, they would not get selected either because they'd be filtered out because they're doing a terrible job. So that's what I'll leave you with. These videos recently have been getting a little bit longer, but I like it. I like going in a lot more depth about these things. And I hope you guys like it too. You seem like it because you're watching for longer and longer periods of time. So for our next video on this topic, we're going to be talking about combining the input with the output. Oh, interesting. So they're using IO psychology similar terms here, input and output. We call those predictors and outcome variables. And so we'll be talking about how they do that, how they make sure that the inputs and outputs align and that they make sense, they're coherent with each other. So we'll get to that next time. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more content. We're constantly coming up with more things. We're constantly innovating in a ton of different ways. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, critiques, please put them in the comment box. I'm trying to get caught up on responding to all those questions. If there's a very thoughtful question, I do try to spend a lot of time thinking about it before I actually comment. If it's not a thoughtful question, if it's just like something rude, I will just like make a your mom joke because that's how I am. So thanks for watching, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye.